He was an American flautist living in London, studying at the Royal Academy of Music. At only 20 years of age, he was intelligent, gifted, talented, a prodigy. On the evening of June 24, 2009, he performed at the Academy in London Soundscapes, featuring the music of composers such as Joseph Hayden, Frideric Handel, and Felix Mendelssohn. But his flute wasn't the only thing he brought with him the evening of his performance. He had with him a relatively large piece of luggage, a rolling suitcase that contained in it the accoutrements of a thief, gloves, a small flashlight, a pair of wire cutters, a glass cutting saw with a diamond blade. After the concert, he retrieved the suitcase from his locker and put his plan into motion, making his way towards the Natural History Museum in the town of Tring. This wasn't the first time he'd been there, but it would certainly be his last. After months of reconnaissance, investigating, casing, scouting, scrutinizing, studying, evaluating, analyzing, and planning, he was confident that he would be able to make his way around the walls, the barbed wire, the cameras, and the guards in order to get what he was there to pilfer. A collection of coveted relics of the past, many of which no longer exist anywhere in the world. Unique, rare, endangered, extinct, priceless, and irreplaceable. All for a hobby that grew into an obsession and a golden flute. In this latest series, I'll be taking you across the pond to England for one of the most baffling crimes ever carried out. This is California Dreaming, and you are listening to the tale of the Great Feather Heist. Hello, dreamers, and welcome back to the show. This is an independent one-woman production, and there are a number of ways that you can support the podcast. You can leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you listen to the show on, preferably 5 stars if you truly enjoy listening. It pushes us up the charts and helps new listeners discover us. You can recommend the show in true crime podcast fan groups. You can like our Facebook page, leave a rating for the show there too, join our discussion group, and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. And if you would like to go above and beyond, you can support us on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you will not only be helping us keep the lights on, you will also gain access to dozens of exclusive full-length episodes and multi-part series cases as well. We are currently in the middle of a series where we delve into the 2005 fire that happened at a warehouse in Vallejo, California, where more than $250 million worth of wine was destroyed. And if you are not yet a member of Patreon, I'd like to remind you that I have released the first of 8 parts of a series we did last year on the mysterious death of Morgan Ingram. So the first part is available for free for everybody to listen to, just so you can check out what Patreon is all about. This week, I'd like to thank Ann W., Tina M., Thomas M., and Jennifer R. for either joining Patreon, raising their pledge, or opting in on the annual subscription. And if a subscription is not your thing, you can make a one-time contribution through PayPal by using my email at californiapod@gmail.com. And for the very last time, I want to remind you that most of this episode is based on the research and investigation into this crime conducted by Kirk Johnson, the founder of the List Project. Johnson wrote a book about the story that we are covering entitled The Feather Thief, Beauty, Obsession, and the Natural History Heist of the Century. And as always, it will be referenced in the episode as needed and in the show notes. In the last part, which was part 6, we finished up with Edwin's sentencing for his crime, breaking into the museum. And from there, Kirk Johnson took us on his years-long odyssey, trying to track down the bird skins that were still missing from the museum listed as being stolen by Edwin when he broke in. We went through the better part of Kirk's efforts to try and sort through what became of the missing skins. We went through some of the places that he traveled to, the people that he talked to, but he was coming up upon dead end after dead end. And the much desired interview with Edwin was still eluding him. So we're going to pick up the story from where we left off with Kirk's search for the missing skins, and we're going to see where that ends up taking him. And this is the final part of the series, so we can finally finish up with the tale of the feather heist. Kirk Johnson eventually quit his own nonprofit, the List Project. They constantly had trouble getting funding, and while the project did manage to relocate more than 2,000 Iraqi allies, he was burnt out. His memoir about his time in Fallujah, Iraq, was published in 2013. He was going to go ahead and spend time on a book tour, but he was also bent on throwing himself completely into tracking down Edwin Rist and the bird skins that he had stolen from the Tring that were still missing. Though it wasn't exactly easy to explain to people who asked him what he had in store next after his dedicated work to helping Iraqi refugees came to an end. How do you explain going from that to tracking down a dead bird thief? You kind of don't. So it seemed like he was sort of going to keep it low key on the outside while he was secretly consumed with the whole thing every waking hour of every single day. A part of Kirk's book tour had taken him to the Yale campus in New Haven, Connecticut. While he was there, he went to the Peabody Natural History Museum, where he had an opportunity to speak to the award-winning ornithology professor at the museum, Dr. Richard Prum. Among this doctor's list of accolades, he had his own laboratory. He was an internationally renowned authority on contigas. About 100 of the birds that Edwin stole from the museum were from this specific species. But when Kirk went to his meeting with Dr. Prum, what he hadn't realized is that this guy was trying to find the missing bird skins too. So it was kind of an odd coincidence for Kirk. In fact, Dr. Prum had gone to the annual fly tying symposium the year before Kirk did. And he did so with a heck of a lot more confidence and know-how, considering he was one of the world's leading ornithological authorities. When Kirk was at the symposium, you could feel his very heightened sense of discomfort and his nervousness as he tried talking to all the handlebar mustaches and members-only jackets. Dr. Prum certainly wasn't put off or intimidated by anybody's mustache. He marched up and down the aisles of the vendors, questioning everybody, taking names, ready to kick somebody's ass, or, at the very least, report these people. He did not use very nice words to describe these fly-tying individuals. He wanted to turn anybody who so much as had a single feather that came from the Tring Museum over to the proper authorities. In fact, he called the local Fish and Wildlife Office the weekend of the symposium, and this was in 2010. The break-in was in the previous year of 2009. So Dr. Prum was certain that those birds were floating around the fly-tying community, and he wanted them to send one of their agents to the symposium, but it just so happened that one of their agents had been killed by an intoxicated deer hunter, and the memorial services for that slain agent were being held the same weekend as the symposium, so they weren't able to send anyone, even if they wanted to. It bothered Dr. Prum to no end that these fly-tying F-words were all gathered there in New Jersey, just all out in the open, selling some of the most exotic, rare, and endangered birds and their feathers from all over the world right there. All right there in this hotel banquet hall. Seriously illegal crimes happening right under their noses. He wanted the Fish and Wildlife agents to haul them all off to jail. But they said they had a memorial service to attend to. But honestly, as the story has gone along, I kind of got the feeling that they just really couldn't be bothered with it. And just as Kirk had gone down one rabbit hole after another in a search for Edwin and all the birds that he'd stolen, Dr. Prom had done the same exact thing, except he had the additional agenda of trying to crush the fly tying community that caused all of this in the first place. He kept referring to them as those damn or those effing fly tyers. He really hated them. He wanted the media to vilify them and their actions to a point where they and their hobby could be wiped out once and for all. There was nothing more that offended him than the fact that these people feverishly chased after bird skins and feathers just so they could make their little fishing hooks. And the obscene amounts of money that these people were willing to pay to have these bird skins and their feathers that had been preserved for centuries, some of them, so that they could just chop them up into pieces and pluck them of all their feathers, offended Dr. Prum to no end. And if any of them are ever questioned about the origins of their bird skins or their feathers, every single one of them will claim that they all originated from Victorian times, long before laws protecting them went into effect, or that they got the birds from their grandparents. Every one of them, every time. But having spent nearly his entire life studying these very birds that they have on display for sale at the symposium, Dr. Prum knew that not all of these were from centuries ago. It's just not possible for these fly-tying people to be in possession of any of these bird skins or feathers without having broken a series of laws to get them, period. In this conversation, Kirk detailed it in his book, and he remarked, "I don't understand why they would take such risks in the pursuit of their hobby." Dr. Prum replied, "People don't actually fish with this shit, right? So what is this about? It's about this fixation, this obsession with originality. Well, there's no effing originality in the world. Who are these guys? They're dentists from Ohio. What claim do they have to originality in anything?" The doctor kind of chuckled when Kirk told him that Edwin did have a customer who bought bird skins from him who was actually a dentist. The doctor continued his rant. "What I see is a story of the struggle for authenticity, to try to make what people are doing meaningful. What they've done is enshrine this in a period where English fishermen were members of a colonial power that ruled the entire globe and could extract fascinating things from it, then sell them in commercial markets. But that dream is extinct. That world is gone. When I work on feathers, knowledge is a consequence. When I pluck a feather to destroy it, we discover things about the world that nobody knew before." Kirk's takeaway from what Dr. Prum was saying, and this is a direct quote from him, "Edwin and the Feather Underground were a bunch of fetishists, practicing candy-ass, ridiculous, parasitic activity that the doctor would be perfectly happy to see go extinct." When their meeting came to an end, Dr. Prum gave Kirk a thumb drive. When he got back to his computer, he plugged it in and he found screenshots of all of Edwin's posts, all the pictures of the birds that he had stolen that he had up for sale that existed nowhere else, not even in the Wayback Machine. And it was detailed and very extensive. Edwin had put a great deal of effort into making his website like a showroom of birds with ornate descriptors of each one. It was obvious Edwin had put in a great deal of time and effort to showcase the stolen birds in order to bring in buyers willing to pay top dollar. And that was one of the issues the prosecutor in Edwin's case wanted the Crown judge to consider, that this was purely a financially motivated crime. He stole the birds so that he could make thousands of dollars. But his attorney managed to distract everyone from that with an Asperger's diagnosis, insisting that it was a misguided, impulsive crime motivated by the desire to tie authentic salmon flies. While that was part of it, this whole thing was a win-win for Edwin. Not only would he be flush with feathers to tie whatever flies that he wanted, he'd be flush with cash too. The thumb drive also had a screenshot of edwinrist.com, a URL that he registered 2 weeks after the burglary. It was obvious the website was created for the sole purpose of selling bird skins, based on what Kirk found that Edwin was writing on his page. He wrote, "I have become interested in retailing fly tying materials, a venture that started as an attempt to fund a new flute purchase, but soon turned into a larger, more extensive hobby." Then Kirk found the name of somebody that he had not yet heard of before, and he was fairly certain that he knew everybody in Edwin's circle of fly tyers. He found that Edwin had written, "I am currently working on a book about salmon flies, both modern and classic. This work will include details on dozens of patterns. In addition, a large variety of exotic feathers and birds will be featured, along with the magnificent artwork of Long Wink from Norway. Check back here often for progress, updates, and photos." So this wasn't a name that Kirk had heard before, and he just had to know who this Long Wing person was. So it's no surprise that Kirk was not friends with Edwin on Facebook, but he was friends with friends of Edwin's, and he managed to talk one of them into letting him use his account so he could snoop around on Edwin's page since it was set to private. He wanted to see if he could figure out who Long was, so that mutual friend allowed Kirk into his account. And when Kirk navigated over to Edwin's page, he found posts and pictures, mentions, comments, and interactions involving Long everywhere, all over. In fact, Long was Edwin's traveling companion when he had gone to Japan back in 2010, when he went to tie salmon flies under the cherry blossoms. There were pictures of them dining out, going shopping. Clearly, they were very close friends. Among the posts were also some of Long's artwork. He was a painter, and he particularly enjoyed painting birds. And there was one that Kirk had recognized from all of his snooping around the internet searching for anything Edwin related. It was a painting of 3 birds that are often used in classic Victorian-era fly tying. He saw the painting somewhere in the fly tying forum, so he went to the Wayback Machine and he finally found it. It was a painting gifted to Edwin, but it had also been posted in the forum by somebody with the username Goku, Goku. The user who had been helping Edwin broker bird skins and feather packets and sales transactions. And Kirk was like, duh, I should have put the 2 and 2 together a long time ago. It wasn't like either one of them were trying to hide their friendship. So, whatever the case, Kirk finally knew now that Long Wink was the accomplice that he suspected all along. His username on the fly tying forum was Goku. Kirk then started wondering how much of an accomplice Long had actually been. Was he there in person with Edwin the night that he broke into the Tring Museum? I mean, yeah, it could have been pulled off by Edwin alone, but it sure would have been a hell of a lot easier with somebody else's help, especially if he was going to make it out of that window with nearly 300 bird skins, an amount of birds the museum opined would have taken 6 garbage bags to carry. Maybe it was Long, all this time, who had been the one who dreamt up the scheme to break into the museum and steal the birds, and Edwin was recruited by him. Perhaps he was the one that was behind it all. And then ultimately, Edwin would be the one holding the bag, taking the fall for the whole thing while Long skated. Nobody had even considered it, that perhaps Edwin had been set up, being that he was so naive and impressionable. I mean, I don't really know about all that. Edwin was quite intelligent, but I guess it doesn't mean you aren't gullible when it comes to some savvy international criminal mastermind, I suppose. The thought that Long may have been the driving force behind the heist turned the entire case on its head for Kirk. So while Kirk was on a flight headed to another book signing, going from where he lived in Boston at that time to Chicago, he got onto Facebook on his phone to look around a private fly tying group that he had joined at some point. And he got there just in time to see a heated comment thread that resulted from a newcomer coming to the group and inadvertently posting an article about Edwin's break-in at the Tring. Apparently, this news was brand new to him, but it elicited some heated responses from other group members who had strong opinions about the whole fiasco. The group members involved in the conversations began discussing the birdskins that had still yet to be recovered. They talked about Edwin having a mate somewhere out there that still was yet to be investigated, and that the skins might be in this person's possession. And it seemed like that the members of the forum also believed that this other person who was in cahoots with Edwin was the one who was the brains behind the whole operation and is still out there doing what he's doing, thinking that he's gotten away with his crimes. And finally, someone commented that the person involved in the Tring heist was somebody named Long, and then insinuated that he wouldn't get away with it forever. In all the searches related to this crime that Kirk had done, this was the first time he had ever seen Long being talked about, and being talked about being the mastermind of the break-in. Eventually, Long appeared in the conversation thread and denied that he had anything to do with the break-in. He said he knew there was talk of his involvement, but it just wasn't true. His life isn't all about fly tying. In his words, it's just an effing hobby. Personally, I think Long is just as infatuated with fly tying as many of the others that we've come across throughout this story. Well, actually, I know that he is, but we haven't gotten that far yet. But I get his need to try to downplay it here on the public forum. It's not like he's so obsessed, he says, that he's going to start breaking into museums. So like I said, Kirk was on a flight when he encountered this fiery conversation. So when he noticed that a flight attendant was shooting him some dirty looks for still having his device on, he promptly turned it off. He took whatever screenshots that he could, but by the time he was able to power his phone back on, once he landed or was about to land, the post in the conversation was gone. Kirk reached out to Long to see if he wanted to talk to him about his story, but Long turned him down. Kirk was certain that this was a guy who was in possession of the missing birdskins. So the word had gone back to Edwin that people were making accusations against Long. So after years of staying absolutely silent, having nothing to say to anyone on any fly tying forum online, he went on to the one who had banned all the discussions of him and the Tring Museum to make a post entitled Long Wink. According to Kirk, this is what Edwin wrote. Ladies and gentlemen of the fly tying world. Yeah, ladies, right? We have not heard from one single fly tying woman in this whole entire series, have we? I actually found it kind of intriguing that Edwin addressed both ladies and gentlemen, so I way veered off topic yet again and did a quick Google search for women salmon fly tyers, and every single result took me to a woman named Megan Boyd. I really didn't want to spend too much time away from the main part of the story to get into this because I know this part's going to be pretty lengthy, but I just had to look. So I glanced at Megan Boyd's Wikipedia page since it was the top result. So Megan Boyd was born January 29th, 1915 in Surrey, England, but she spent most of her life in, and I want to excuse my pronunciation if I get this wrong, but looks like it's Kindredwell, Scotland, Kindtradwell, and she was best known for tying Atlantic salmon flies, her favorite being the popham fly, which you can look up, but I'm going to post a picture of it on social media if I remember to, or somebody remind me to, or maybe somebody can post it for me. During World War II, Megan had a variety of jobs, including delivering milk. She worked as an auxiliarist with the Coast Guard, which is a non-law enforcement position where she worked in public education, vessel safety, patrols, and other maritime security jobs. Megan was kind of eccentric. She was known for usually dressing in men's clothing, like a dress shirt and a tie and a sports coat and heavy boots. and she also kept her hair cropped very short. Megan started fly tying lessons from a river keeper on the estate where she lived, and she was under his tutelage for several years, where she was taught that the most important aspects of fly tying were quality and precision. She became really well known for her skills, and fly fishers began paying her to make flies for them, and her reputation continued to grow from there, becoming best known for her ability to tie the classic Victorian favorites. The flies that she made were not only precise replicas of the classic patterns, they were also extremely durable and would last over the course of several fishing seasons. Megan would end up tying flies for almost 7 decades, and she tied tens of thousands of salmon flies. And I don't think I've mentioned this, but it takes about 10 hours to tie a classic salmon fly. And yet, having tied flies that the salmon just loved, Megan herself never fished and was quoted as having said, "Now, to disappoint all my customers, I do not fish, I have no interest in fishing, and I cannot even tie a fly to a cast." In 1935, when she was 20, Megan moved out of her family home to a cottage built almost 30 years earlier from rummaged materials in Scotland. She actually didn't have running water or electricity there until sometime in the late 1980s. In a shed next to her cottage, she set up a desk where she worked by the light of the sun or by a kerosene lantern for as many as 14 hours a day, filling orders for her customers. Salmon anglers from around the world came to see her, to not only place their orders, but to also watch her at work. If she wasn't home, she would leave a notebook and a pencil under her front doormat so people could jot down the flies that they wanted to order. While Megan mostly tied classic traditional fly patterns, there is one that she created herself called the Macon Boyd. I will try to remember to post that one up too. You'll also find a picture of her if you searched in a suit and tie at her desk with her dog watching her tie flies. Megan won several awards over her lifetime, starting as early as 1938. It's been said that arguably the best fly tyers in the world are in Scotland, but the best in Scotland is Megan Boyd. In an article in the American Fly Fisher in 1996, they called Megan's flies magical concoctions. Hers were the Tiffany's of the fly tying world. Queen Elizabeth awarded Megan the British Empire Medal in 1971 and invited her to receive the medal at Buckingham Palace. But Megan wrote back to the Queen and told her, "I can't make it." Not only was she really busy playing her bridge and doing her work, she also didn't have a dog sitter. So the Queen wrote her back and said, "Yeah, I get it. I've got dogs too. They totally take up all my time." So instead, Prince Charles went ahead and gave the medal to Megan himself. They were actually really good friends. Charles used Megan's flies all the time, and he spent time at her cottage. When he got married to Diana, Megan gifted him a number of salmon flies with a note that read, "Dear Charlie, best wishes to you and Lady Diana. May you enjoy a lifetime of peace and happiness. I made a special fly for the occasion that I would like you to give to your wife. Tell her you will have the best catch you'll ever have. Signed, Megan Boyd." Most of her life, Megan tied flies by the light of the sun or a lantern until she finally got some electricity up in that cottage of hers. But when she entered into her 70s, her eyesight began betraying her, so she retired in 1985. She eventually ended up living in a nursing home. Prince Charles had visited her there in 2000, where they mostly talked about her favorite fly, the popham, considered one of the most complicated and beautiful classic patterns ever to emerge from Great Britain. Megan Boyd passed away on November 15, 2001, in Gospey, Scotland, at the age of 86. I do want to point out that Megan Boyd isn't the only notable woman in the world of fly tying. If you scroll a little ways down on the second page of Google results, you'll find an article entitled 6 Women Who Are Revolutionizing the World of Fly Tying. And they're all American with the exception of one Canadian. So fly tying is not completely a man's world, as we might have been led to believe if we've only ever read Kirk's book and most of the things we find online. So anyway, back to Edwin's post that led us into that off-topic conversation of Megan Boyd. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the fly tying world, most of you have heard of me, and for obvious reasons, I have chosen to remove myself from mainstream fly tying. However, I have found a need to address something that has been disturbing me for some time. My friend, Long Wing, from Norway, has been publicly slandered for his supposed involvement in the museum theft that I committed alone in 2009. 2 people, one from Denmark and another from the UK, even went so far as to go on a rumor spreading vendetta that Long was the brains behind the operation. I am more appalled at the behavior of the fly tying world towards Long than the fly tying world is at my own actions." The admin who had been keeping the website scrubbed of all discussion involving Edwin and the Tring was pissed off and commented on Edwin's post. "I am done with this BS. I've tried to keep this away from members for years now, and you are still like a bad weed. You rid yourself of it, and it just keeps coming back uglier than ever. You want to defend Long, by all means do so, but I fear you have only driven the nail deeper into Long's back. You have no clue of the time and effort that I have spent trying to keep this one subject out of this forum over the years. It has been a struggle, to say the least." Up until the time that Edwin had made that post, Kirk had been trying to get him to grant him an interview for about 3 years, but was turned down or ignored every single time. But now that Edwin had broken his silence on the topic, Kirk decided to strike while the iron was hot. He emailed Edwin again, urging him, "Now's the time." And finally, for the very first time, Edwin replied to him. He explained to Kirk that choosing to speak to him about his story would be rubbing salt into his wounds. He'd have to take some time to consider it. Kirk immediately asked for a time and place that they could meet, not wanting to lose this momentum. But after a couple of weeks, he still hadn't heard back from Edwin, so he started to think maybe he was too pushy. Finally, Edwin replied and offered Kirk a date that they could meet where he lived in Dusseldorf, Germany. That was only a week away, though. Kirk went ahead and booked a crazy expensive flight for himself and his wife to fly there. He just couldn't let this chance slip by. He had been trying for this meeting with Edwin for years. But then Kirk's wife was like, is there anything that we should be concerned about? I mean, is this safe? And dreamers, I get it. The fly tying community mocked Kirk for worrying about meeting up with this little punk-ass flute player. But the reality is that Kirk didn't know this guy. They were going to a foreign country on very short notice. His wife, she hadn't been married to him for all that long, but she knew what he had been through. She was an attorney who partnered with the List project, and he had been to some of the most dangerous places in the world to work, almost having lost his own life in Iraq. I think Kirk's wife had every reason to be concerned for both of their safety, and the whole thing was kind of impetuous. I don't think that anyone in the fly tying community who mocked Kirk for his concerns really had the right to. And besides, if this meeting with Edwin had happened before Kirk was married, he wouldn't have even thought anything about his own safety or security. But he took into consideration that he was married now, and he had to factor that in. They had just bought their first home. They wanted to start a family. Things were different now than when he first started chasing after the feather thief. But Kirk himself kind of mocked the idea. This guy, Edwin, he's kind of a dork, and he plays a flute, and he robbed a museum of dead birds for their feathers. It sounded kind of silly. But again, it wasn't just about him now. So he decided that he was probably being more reckless than he should be. And besides, he didn't know Edwin from any other average person. He'd never spoken to him on the phone or even heard the sound of his voice anywhere. Edwin had been avoiding talking to Kirk for years, and then all of a sudden he would agree to talk? What if this guy has a really foul temper? What if Kirk says something that totally pisses him off? Especially if Edwin takes exception to the fact that if Kirk was going to confront him with all the evidence that he had collected through the years, it could be very triggering for Edwin. So Kirk decided that he wanted to hire security, but he didn't want it to cause problems with his meeting with Edwin or cause him to back out. He found a security firm based in Dusseldorf, and he spoke to one of their guys, Jan. I don't know how it's pronounced in German, but it's Jan. And he is exactly what Kirk had pictured the average German guy to be like in talking to him on the phone. Totally flat, monotone, serious, completely lacking any emotion or any type of inflection when he spoke. He was available for 52 euros per hour for a maximum of 6 hours. So Kirk hired him. And Jan asked about Edwin. Tell me about this man. Well, he's an American. He studied music in England for several years before moving to Germany to play the flute. And Jan interrupted. Not this biography. What is his size? Kirk really had no idea, so he took a stab in the dark. 6 feet tall, maybe? His age? 26. Uh-huh. You have met him before? No. And I don't even know if he'll show up. Where are you meeting and when? May 26 at the Stage 47 Hotel in Dusseldorf. What is his name? Edwin Rist. What did he steal? Feathers. Jan was quiet for a moment. And finally he said, It would be intimidating to have security in the room. Better be out in the hallway with key to room. We have walkie-talkies. Kirk agreed. Jan said, Okay, I send Claus. Bring cash only. Over the next few days, Kirk worked out his series of questions that he felt would best bring out what he really wanted to know. Where are the missing bird skins located? He didn't want to start off with that question, but he wanted to work his way up to it. But all the while, he worried that Edwin might not even show up. The plane tickets had cost an arm and a leg. Dusseldorf, Germany wasn't exactly on Kirk's bucket list of vacation destinations. What if this was just one big joke Edwin wanted to pull on him, having him show up all the way on the other side of the world to nothing and to nobody? Kirk then realized he didn't even have Edwin's cell phone number so that he could call or text when he got there. And then, if Kirk wasn't already questioning and doubting himself all over the place, as he and his wife were checking in at the airport, and by then Kirk had moved to Los Angeles after he had gotten married, so they were at LAX, his wife had another question for Kirk that he also had no idea what the answer was for that. And she said, Tell me again why this guy agreed to talk to you anyway. I kind of get the feeling that Edwin is to Kirk as exotic bird feathers are to Edwin. The night before their meeting, Kirk could not sleep, partly due to his nerves, partly due to the time difference, and partly due to the fact that the German version of the Home Shopping Network was on selling their version of Spanx called Schlankstutz, which I kind of found amusing. I think that's how it's pronounced. Schlankstutz. Schlankstutz. Kirk finally got up into the lounge area of their hotel suite and wired the place for sounds 3 times over. He wanted to make sure that he had a backup recorder and that his backup recorder had a backup recorder. An hour before Edwin was scheduled to arrive, Claus showed up. I'll tell you what Kirk wrote in his book about it because I don't think I could have said it any better. Looking every bit the part, he was a behemoth, 6'4", 250 pounds, and that's 1.93 meters and 113 kilograms, crammed into a tracksuit. He had a buzz cut, he looked as though he shaved with a knife, and he barely spoke a word of English. He gestured to a chair in a dark corner of the hallway outside our room. He produced 2 walkie-talkies from his jacket and handed me one with a reassuring glance. I don't know why, dreamers. I liked it so much that he hired this guy named Claus for this. It's got this low-budget 80s action movie vibe going on, and I'm just so amused by the whole thing. Anyway, while Kirk waited, he couldn't help but flip through the many faces of Edwin Rist that he came to know, the perpetrator of one of the greatest natural history crimes in recent memory, a crime that made him hundreds of thousands of dollars. He was a gifted, accomplished flautist. He was brilliant, but at the same time, capable of doing dumb things young people often do. He possibly struggles with mental health disorders. He possibly has Asperger's syndrome. He certainly cared for his family, wanting part of his take from the museum to go towards helping them out. He had once been the future of fly tying. He might still be, but this Edwin Rist was a pariah within the community as it stands. But he remains one of the best that some had ever witnessed tie salmon flies. Edwin had impulsivity issues. Definitely some shades of narcissistic personality going on there. Yet he was also a felon who managed to pull off one of the most notable crimes natural history museums had ever experienced, and he got off with a slap on the wrist. At some point, Kirk had dozed off in his hotel when the phone rang. It was a lobby letting him know that Edwin was there. Kirk left the room. He gestured over to his man Claus and headed down the elevator. Kirk finally came face to face with Edwin. He was taller than the 6 feet or 1.93 meters that he had guessed. Edwin had on a really nice pair of eyeglasses. He had some rugged stubble going on, and he was wearing a pea coat. As the two of them shook hands, Kirk thought about the 5 years that have passed since Edwin did what he did at the Tring. As they headed up to the hotel room, Kirk had all of these thoughts going through his head. This guy has no idea how much he had consumed his life over the last few years as he hunted down the missing bird skins. And he couldn't help but wonder why Edwin decided to meet with him. And dreamers, if I had to take a guess, I would say narcissism. There's a part of me that felt like since there was another person out there getting attention from this crime, namely Long, I think Edwin was kind of put off by it. Like he insisted that he acted alone when he burglarized the Tring. And everyone had been so impressed, for lack of a better word, that he was able to pull it off. But the internet sleuths and the armchair detectives were still attempting to spread the credit for the crime around over onto his friend Long. And that's just all my speculation. It isn't anything that Kirk wrote about. He just questioned why Edwin decided to come out of hiding, why he decided to break his silence. I also feel like part of the reason why the fly tying community turned their attention towards Long is because there is a big part of the story that feels sort of incomplete or anticlimactic. Like Edwin pulled off this outrageous crime in the name of salmon fly tying. He stirred up all this controversy in the community across the globe. It brought conversations of fly tying into the mainstream media. There was all this hype about it for a couple of years. And all of a sudden, Edwin gets pampered by the British justice system, spends exactly 0 days in prison, goes off to earn his degree from the Royal Academy of Music, and carries on to an illustrious career with a prestigious symphony in Germany. The Tring, the birdskins, the salmon flies, and the fly tying community get left in Edwin's dust. The one loose end that everyone has to hang on to, including Kirk Johnson, are those missing skins, along with the very strong belief that Edwin had an accomplice, and that the accomplice is Long. Justice wasn't served in Edwin's case, so perhaps it could be served in Long's case. That's what I think the fly tying community was hanging on to, and that's what I think perhaps Edwin was attempting to reclaim. And part of that is speaking to Kirk. Again, it's just my theory. So they sat down. Kirk's wife was going to be in charge of recording their conversation. He asked how long Edwin had to talk, and Edwin said a couple of hours, or if this goes into the night, it's up to you. He was kind of friendly about it, which allowed Kirk to be a little more at ease about the whole thing. He did have almost 300 questions, but the ones he really wanted to know about was if it was true he had Asperger's and where the missing birdskins were at. So for 2 hours, the two of them talked about Edwin's background, his upbringing, his family, playing the flute, living in Germany, and of course, fly tying. Kirk quickly developed a liking for Edwin, who had a pleasant personality and a nice sense of humor. His answers were thoughtful and lengthy. If it wasn't for the circumstances under which they had met, he could see Edwin being a close friend in his life. Eventually, Kirk got around to asking him about the break-in and if Edwin had an understanding of how important the birds were to science and to natural history. He said that he was aware that important collections were kept there, including Alfred Wallace's birds, but he didn't realize that he had taken any of those until the next day. When it came to the tags that were on the birds' legs, Edwin said that he didn't take the tags off of all of them. But if he had realized which birds had been collected and tagged by Wallace, he may have tried to have been more respectful about it all. He admitted that he kind of felt like it was a shame that the museum was keeping so many birds that they really didn't need, much to the chagrin of fly tyers all over the place that felt like the museum should offer them up for sale. Edwin shared that same sentiment. He felt like the information that you can get from a 150-year-old bird was finite. If they wanted to collect DNA of the birds because they wanted to somehow prevent or reverse extinction, it wasn't working. Birds were still going extinct and will continue to do so, so there's no point in hoarding them all there in that building. Now, in his book, Kirk interjected this little fun fact by stating that what Edwin was saying here was absurd, that scientists had recently extracted 419 million-year-old bacterial DNA from salt deposits on an old buffalo skin in the Michigan basin, but he didn't stop Edwin to explain that to him. Okay, so dreamers, I was reading this little passage in this book about this DNA, and I was like, what is this all about? So apparently in 2009, according to an article on NBCnews.com, scientists discovered 419 million-year-old DNA intact inside ancient salt deposits, making this genetic material the oldest DNA ever discovered, belonging to a salt-loving bacteria whose ancestors may have been among the first life forms on Earth. There was the DNA found in Michigan that Kirk had referenced, but that DNA turned out to be so similar to modern microbes that scientists figured it had to have been contaminated, but as it turns out, that wasn't the case. The same DNA was found again by a team of researchers out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and they found identical DNA in the same region in the Michigan basin, and it is believed that the DNA basically spent these millions of years hunkered down inside these salt deposits until Canadian researchers came along and dug it all up. So anyway, Edwin did say in his interview with Kirk, "I understand that they're preserved because if they're not, they might fall apart after 50 years in the sunlight or something like that, but they are collecting dust. I didn't have a problem with that because I know this is how museums operate. I do actually think it's a shame that this is how it is. Again, I'm not a scientist, but I do view it as a shame that they are in a box in the dark where an idiot with a rock can go in and take them." Kirk explained to Edwin that when he spoke to the museum curators and to Dr. Prum and how they expressed how upsetting the loss of the birds was and the potential knowledge that they may have had, future questions that may never be answered, how that was all lost. But Edwin was not bothered by it all because he really didn't seem to think that is where the value of the bird skins lay. Where is that aha moment? What is the scientific breakthrough that's supposed to happen if it hasn't happened by now? Time is ticking away. Species are going extinct all the while they think they're sitting on some answers here. And then Edwin insinuated that had the museum put 50 Indian crows up for sale, they would have saved 50 Indian crows from being killed in the wild. The bigger problem is poaching, and by hoarding these birds, the museum is kind of perpetuating the problem. And Kirk was like, hold up. So you are saying that by taking those Indian crows and selling them to fly tyers around the world, you were actually saving birds from being killed in the wild? Edwin kind of smiled and said, well, if you want to get technical about it, it could be true. This whole conversation was interesting to Kirk. It might have even been interesting to us since we've been so invested in this stolen birdskin case, but Kirk's wife was struggling to keep her eyelids open because she was exhausted. And then Kirk started to wonder how Claus was doing out in the hallway. And yes, Kirk realized the moment that he saw Edwin that Claus wasn't necessary. The direction this had gone with Edwin's misguided take on scientific research was annoying to Kirk. It wasn't interesting. It was annoying. So he decided to change the entire subject to the sentencing that Edwin had received. The crime that Edwin committed was the culmination of a year and a half of planning on Edwin's part. There were 299 stolen birds, allegedly, tens of thousands of dollars to be made, damage that could never be undone to the museum, to science, and to history, yet not one single night in jail for Edwin. All because Edwin was diagnosed with Asperger's. But nobody, outside of the Crown Court judge, bought it. People who knew Edwin in the fly tying community called BS. Edwin didn't appear to have any issues socially. He had a girlfriend for 3 years who also attended the Royal Academy of Music up until he was arrested. He had a whole bunch of friends that he easily made at the academy to add to his long list of fly tying friends. And in the hours Kirk had been interviewing Edwin, he doubted the diagnosis himself. Edwin was charming. He was an impressive person to interview. He was thoughtful, perceptive, and he not only followed along with the questioning with ease, he was able to predict where Kirk was headed with his lines of questioning. Kirk described him as disarming, likable, but able to read him masterfully, and he almost never let his guard down. As they talked about Edwin being diagnosed with this mental condition by Borat's cousin, Edwin was like, "You just can't make this stuff up." After going around and around about it with Kirk, he basically admitted that he did what he needed to do. He became what he needed to become in order to not spend a significant amount of time in prison. Edwin also said when it comes to doing what's right and doing what's wrong, his issues with that go back to being homeschooled. The only person he ever got in trouble with was his mom. And once it was over with, everything went back to normal and Mom was happy and loving again. In other words, he had never been made to face real consequences, which may have skewed his perception of right and wrong. This interview went on for hours, so Kirk ordered lunch because he really wanted to get back to it and to breach the topic of Long. He started off by saying that there were those who have suggested that Edwin did not act alone. Edwin interrupted him and insisted that he has repeatedly stated that Long was not involved in the break-in, he did not help him plan it, he wasn't behind it. Edwin sent Long some birds, Long showed them at a fly tying fair, but he didn't sell any, and that Edwin didn't sell him any. Kirk and Edwin began discussing the number of skins that Edwin had sold. But what he was telling Kirk wasn't matching up to what he had told police. But they had gone back and forth about this so much that I'm just not really going to get into it here. It's going to take too long. Edwin echoed the same thing that the fly tyers had said, however. With shoddy record keeping, the Tring Museum could never be certain that Edwin was responsible for all of those missing birdskins. There's no proof that there may have been some of the birdskins that Edwin took and perhaps one or two or several of them had been taken here and there over the years prior to his break-in. But Edwin did not dispute the numbers when he was confronted with it by Detective Hopkin, and Kirk reminded him the Tring Museum had compiled a very detailed spreadsheet of the missing birds. Edwin looked at it and said, okay, yeah, that seems like they kept good records. So they moved on quickly from trying to split hairs over the numbers. Kirk showed Edwin everything that he had compiled regarding Long and explained that it was because of all of this that he finds it hard to believe that Long wasn't involved. Edwin was like, okay. So Kirk finally asked if there are still 64 missing bird skins, should those be returned to the museum too? And where are they? And Edwin replied, if someone has them, I really don't know about it. And the question is, does one individual have them? And Kirk was like, aren't you the one person in the world most uniquely positioned to answer that question? And Edwin replied, in what sense? And Kirk was like, you took the birds. It was you. But all Edwin said was that he really hadn't thought about the missing birds. He doesn't have them. Long doesn't have them. He doesn't know where they are. The detective woman, and that's what he called Detective Adele Hopkin, she was the one who was certain that there was an accomplice. She couldn't believe that I went to the museum with a suitcase and a rock, filled it full of birds, and climbed back out and walked to the train and went home. But Edwin insisted that that's exactly what happened. Kirk finally asked if Edwin thought that Long would speak to him. Edwin said he could try and offered to call Long to encourage him to meet so that they could talk. At this point, Edwin and Kirk had been speaking for 8 hours. It was time to let Edwin go. Even though it looked like Edwin could go on for another 8, Kirk was dead tired. His wife was already long gone asleep, and poor Claus, he was on overtime by then. Edwin told Kirk to feel free to email him with any more questions, and as they said their goodbyes, I think they both knew that they would never see each other again. Kirk paid Claus his money, and he went to bed. The next morning, he had received an email from Long that read, "Hi Kirk, got words from Edwin now, interesting case and interesting story about me. If you want an interview, then I'll be available this summer. Best regards, Long." After Kirk and his wife got back to California, she mentioned that she was kind of perplexed by one of the answers that Edwin had offered to one of Kirk's questions. He had asked what color the suitcase that he brought with him to the Tring Museum was. According to Kirk, Edwin stated, "I don't know. Suitcases are usually black, normally." Kirk agreed with his wife. The answer was kind of weird. How is it that he forgot what color his suitcase was? And then his wife continued and said, not only did his forgetting the color of his suitcase bother her, so did the idea that he managed to fit almost 300 birds into one suitcase, suggesting that there was more than one person there the night of the break-in and that there was more than one suitcase. The window that Edwin went in and out of was kind of narrow, so it couldn't have been much larger than a standard large rolling suitcase. So the two of them decided to try an experiment. They took as many rolled up pairs of socks that they could find to represent the smallest of the birds, the blue chatterer. They took several dozen t-shirts, rolled those up to about the size of the Indian crow. They used some of her leggings rolled up to represent the resplendent quetzals. Washcloths were the flame bowerbirds. When they got about 80 items rolled up and placed into their large suitcase, it was more than half filled. Kirk was fairly certain that Edwin would not have been able to fill the suitcase with 219 more items. There was a point when Kirk was told that the night of the break-in that Edwin also had a backpack with him, but it slipped his mind to ask during their 8-hour-long interview. And he couldn't email him anymore. Edwin had stopped answering. If someone was with Edwin that night, the only person that Kirk could think of it being was Long. When the summer came, Kirk booked a flight to Norway. And when he was on that flight to head there to interview Long, He was certain that he would be able to collect the remaining missing birds, especially if his suspicions about him having been Edwin's accomplice the night of the break-in was true. Thinking back on the conversation that he had had with Edwin about Long, he felt like Edwin's assertions that Long wasn't involved and wasn't there were kind of flimsy. In fact, Kirk's thinking began shifting to the idea that it was Long who was the mastermind of the whole break-in, not Edwin, and that the two of them did it together, each with his own suitcase, and that one of them acted as the lookout while the other raided the bird vault. Kirk was pretty much consumed with proving his theory, and he was even able to convince Long to have their meeting at his own home, located in the municipality of Asker, which is about a half-hour train ride from the capital of Norway, which is Oslo. He figured that Long might slip up and leave something laying around that could implicate him in the break-in. Kirk also had with him a list of questions designed to see if he could catch Long in a lie. He had a whole bunch of documents and printouts from everything that he was able to find online, as well as a transcript of his interview with Edwin. So he was ready just to make sure that Long was being truthful. Kirk had told Detective Hopkin that he was going there to visit Long, so she was anxious to hear back from him to see what, if anything, he found. Edwin told Kirk that Long was, quote-unquote, basically a millionaire. However, as Long had met Kirk down near the end of the footpath that led through a forest towards his home, he really didn't get the millionaire vibe. When they got close to where Long lived, Kirk spotted an apartment complex that looked to be about 50 years old. Long lived there with his sister and his conure, Rin. And a conure falls somewhere in between a large parakeet and a small parrot. It squawked and flew towards Kirk and landed on his shoulder and stayed there basically the entire time that he was at Long's apartment. So Long's place was cramped. His bedroom consisted of a twin-size bed that sat on the floor and an outrageously messy fly-tying desk. They decided to talk in the kitchen, which would have not been as cramped if Rin's enormous cage hadn't been in there. There were drawings of birds made by Long hanging on all the walls, shelves with all kinds of fly-tying books, at least 2 aquariums, one with fish living in it, the other that used to have something living in it. The kitchen table had business cards all over it. All of them were from fly tyers. Kirk was trying to be nosy without looking like he was being nosy, but he was pretty sure that Long could tell that he was looking at all his stuff all over the place. Kirk stated in his book, if Long was a millionaire, he certainly hadn't let it affect his lifestyle. They began talking about Long's life. He was very close to the same age as Edwin. They were born the same year. He was born in Trondheim in Norway in 1988. His parents were refugees, having fled Vietnam as the South fell to communism when the war ended. They were in Malaysia for a minute before making their way to Norway. Long's dad was a restaurant worker, and in his spare time, he enjoyed salmon fishing. Long began to show an interest in drawing birds by the time he was about 3. He would draw birds that he saw flying around outside, or he would copy pictures of birds that he found in books. When Long was 6, he lost his mother to cancer. After her death, Long's father fell apart. He distanced himself from the family, he developed a severe gambling habit, and he barely spent time with Long and his 3 siblings. They weren't removed from the home, but rather, whatever Norway's equivalent to the Department of Children and Family Services is there, counselors and social workers began visiting the home regularly, and soon they were taking them to all of their appointments, to doctor's visits, and to their extracurricular activities. At the age of 10, Long and his brother were removed from the family home and sent to live in an all-boys institution for those who had been from difficult or troubled homes. He wasn't taken out of the school that he had been attending, but being in the institution did have an effect on his ability to socialize with his classmates, and Long began to withdraw, just as his father had. Alone most of the time, Long began taking up the hobby of fly tying. He didn't have much with him to guide him. He could remember the various colorful flies that his dad used to use when he would go salmon fishing. He tried to make replicas of those. Eventually, he got his hands on a fly tying magazine, so he began working on replicating the flies that he found pictured in there. As time went on, he began attempting to tie more complicated and more expensive flies, and soon he went and got a job at a nearby pet store so that he could earn some money in order to buy the feathers that he needed. One of Long's teachers at school, her name was Greta. She could tell that Long was a bright child, beyond his years, and she understood that he had a difficult home life. And in a way, she and her husband kind of became parent-like figures, not only in Long's life, but in the lives of his siblings. When she found out that his favorite hobby was fly tying, and that he was really, really good at it, they took him on a trip across the North Sea to Denmark to visit a shop called Fugel and Fjør, flue binding, which translates to bird and feather fly tying, and it is owned by Jens Pilgaard. If you remember, Jens is the one who purchased a few of the bird skins from Edwin for $6,000 and sent him that pheasant. So from there, Jens began mentoring Long, and the two of them became very close friends. By the time Long got to high school, he had become one of the best fly tyers in Norway. He soon became a regular on the classic fly tying forum, where he found that fly tyers twice or even 3 times his age were asking him for advice. Many members of the forum not only admired the flies that he tied, but also his artwork. Another member of the forum who took notice of Long was Edwin. Long had already known a lot about him, so when Edwin reached out and began talking to him through direct messages, Long was really excited to be talking to one of the best and well-known fly tyers in the world. As Kirk sat there and learned more and more about Long, he realized the idea of going into this interview as a tough, hardened investigator ready to settle things with this international illegal wildlife trafficker was just not the direction this was all headed. This young man, pouring him a hot cup of tea over the bread and cheese that he had just served his guest, was sincere and passionate, creative, intelligent, yet broken. He wasn't anything what Kirk had been expecting. Kirk did find out that Edwin had sent Long a few bird skins, a blue chatterer, 1 flame bowerbird. Long said that Edwin sent him 3, maybe 4 birds. Kirk remained somewhat suspicious because his story matched up nearly exactly to Edwin's. But it could also be because that was the truth, not necessarily something that was rehearsed. Kirk showed him screenshots of some of the posts that he had made of the bird skins for sale, and Long told him he didn't have those birds with him physically, that he just made those posts for Edwin. And Kirk was curious, what did he need your help for, as he was perfectly capable of doing all of this on his own? Kirk started asking questions in rapid-fire succession, wanting to know details about all of the sales, all of the money, and who got this money and who got the birds. But Long repeatedly said that he just couldn't remember everything. But Kirk didn't believe him. If he had sold a bird for thousands of dollars, he would have remembered if he got that money or not. Even Rin the conure began feeling the tension in the room. Long said that he didn't sell any one thing for thousands of dollars, that he was selling packs of feathers. But when Kirk pressed for more details, like whether he sent the feathers to the buyers or if it was Edwin, he still continued to insist that he didn't remember. While Long had been polite and gracious and endearing, he did know that members of the fly tying community distanced himself from him just as they had done to Edwin because of him being associated with the burglary and selling things online because of his close friendship with him. Even Jens Pilgaard had terminated their friendship over it, and Jens had treated Long as if he were his own son. Kirk wasn't buying that he had forgotten everything, especially when he lost so much over it. Finally, Long stated, I've spent 4 years trying to forget all this. You're trying to bring it all to the surface. It's really hard though, because I'm trying for so long to put this behind me. The details are quite unclear to myself because I'm trying to close this case." And Kirk was like, "Yeah, same here." One of the first calls that Edwin made following his arrest was to Long. He confessed to him everything that he had done. It wasn't until then that Long realized what was going on. He said that he felt betrayed by his good friend, that he was getting dragged down along with him. He thought he was being helpful, but when he found out Edwin had stolen the birds, he felt as though he'd been stabbed in the back. Long insisted that the bird skins Edwin had given him, he sent back to the museum. He also began trying to take down everything that he had posted online on Edwin's behalf, thinking that people were going to think that he was in on the whole thing. But it really only made him look even worse. For his time and effort, Edwin did pay him in both money and in feathers. Long wanted feathers from the blue chatterer and the Indian crow just as much as everyone else had wanted them. So much so that he just simply didn't question the origin of the birds. Edwin had revealed in his interview with Kirk that it was Long's fault that he was caught, that Long had been talking about the birdskins online indiscriminately, and it led investigators right to him. Now, we know that isn't what happened. It was that North Ireland police officer who saw that rare birdskin at the Dutch festival and reported it to Detective Hopkin. When Kirk told Long that Edwin blamed him, this was news to him, and he was disappointed. From what Long was saying, the only thing he feels is sorry for Edwin. He didn't condone what he had done, but as his friend, he supported him. Kirk could see that Long was weaving in and out of his emotions, part angry, part hurt. In the end, when asked about the missing birdskins, Long said he didn't know where those would be. Kirk was exasperated. How could the both of them not know? Long said that only a couple of birdskins and some feathers were sold through him. They wrapped up their conversation for the day, and Kirk left really not knowing if there was ever any real admission of wrongdoing on Long's part, mostly because he didn't feel like he did anything wrong, but at the same time there was nothing passionate or convincing that came from Long insisting that he was innocent. After 10 hours, Kirk had to leave to catch the last train back to Oslo. Long walked him to the station. As Kirk boarded, Long was about to say something, but he was unable to finish his thought before the doors of the train closed on them. The next morning, Kirk was awakened by a call from the lobby telling him that Long was there to visit him. Kirk went down there, and the two walked to go find some coffee. It was clear from the look on Long's face that the talk they had the previous day was very unnerving for him. He was not only bothered by the prospect of losing whatever friends he had left in the fly tying community, but that he was also losing his morals and his ethics, and whether or not it was possible for him to live in this world without being so destructive to it. He wondered about the animals that had died, for the belt that Kirk was wearing, or the wallet he had, whatever he had made out of leather, or the meat that they eat, the suffering of these animals, how much human beings cause it all. Kirk told him that this really wasn't meant to be an issue involving cruelty to animals. This was more about the criminal aspect of Edwin's break-in. The two of them walked around Oslo when they passed a store that had some animal furs displayed in their front window. They walked inside and the store manager kind of gave them the up and down once over, certain that neither one of them had the kinds of money to buy anything in her shop. At the end of the store, there was a stack of polar bear rugs, like real polar bears skinned and made into rugs, ranging in price from $25,000 to $50,000. I looked at a website called bearskinworld.com, and they advertise on their site they have rugs made from black bears, polar bears, wolves, cougars, buffalo, reindeer, and cows. Though they didn't currently have any polar bears or cougars available due to an incredibly high demand, apparently. And then when Kirk told the store manager that he was American, she snickered at him and scoffed and huffed and puffed and said he'd never get through customs with a polar bear skin rug. And the reason for that would be American dentist Walter Palmer. If y'all remember, he was the one that stirred up international outrage when he shot and killed Cecil the lion with a bow and arrow in Zimbabwe in July of 2015. Cecil was a 13-year-old lion that lived in a protected area that had been tagged and followed with GPS for a longitudinal study by a team out of the University of Oxford in England. What made this particular killing so controversial was not only the fact that Cecil was one of the national park's main tourist attractions, but also because he was lured out of the protected area where he lived so he could be shot legally, apparently. And that first shot only wounded him, and from there, Cecil was tracked for another 12 hours approximately, so Palmer could shoot him with another arrow, finally killing him. And Palmer had paid about $50,000 to a hunting guide that would enable him to shoot Cecil. A hunting blind was built for him in a nearby property where he hid until Cecil was lured towards him. And then he shot and wounded him, and then after that they tracked him until the next morning when they were able to finish him off. Then Cecil was skinned and he was beheaded, and his skeleton was eventually found as he had been scavenged by birds of prey. As for Cecil's tracking collar, it was found later some distance away from his skeletal remains, and it had been alleged that Cecil had been lured out of the protected area with an elephant carcass that had been dragged about 330 yards or 300 meters away from where Cecil lived. Therefore, the area where Palmer actually shot him was technically legal. It was in part due to Palmer's actions that stricter laws were enacted when it comes to the import of large game, as various countries banned the import of lion trophies following Cecil's death. Now, the downside of all of this is that it resulted in a loss of revenue from tourism to Zimbabwe because people who were planning on traveling there to go hunting canceled. Revenue was also lost because Cecil the lion himself was a big draw for visitors. He had become so used to seeing human beings, he wasn't afraid of them, and he was pretty docile. And with the hunting of lions having experienced a large decrease following this event, the lion population became unsustainably high, which ended up having an effect on the population of other animals that were preyed on by lions. There were some that took exception to all the outrage that resulted from Cecil's death, particularly by Americans. Those who lived in villages surrounded by conservation areas see the lions as something to be feared, with some going so far as accusing Americans who were so outraged by this as caring more about African animals given cute, affectionate names more than they care about African people. Of course, Palmer and his dental practice in Minnesota received some harsh backlash, but it didn't really do much to put a stop to his desire to hunt large game, because in 2019, Palmer paid about $100,000 to hunt and kill in Altai Argali in Magnolia, and this is a species of ram. It is the largest ram in the world. It is endangered, with only 19,000 of them left in the world, and it is considered a national treasure in Mongolia. But the country permits trophy hunting, and it is very expensive, and when money's involved, being endangered and being a national treasure doesn't really seem to matter. What we find in all of this is that people rationalize the things that they do. Edwin rationalized his crime by saying that he took from an institution that did not need these birds because there was no longer any meaningful scientific information that could be gleaned from keeping them locked up in drawers. Palmer rationalized what he did in Zimbabwe by saying the killing of Cecil was to be blamed on his hunting guide because he didn't know any better. Long said the only thing that he did wrong was trust his good friend, but also rationalized it all by comparing their actions as fly tyers as being less harmful than someone who eats meat or wears leather. And the community of fly tyers distanced themselves from Edwin's crimes, and they dismissed the possibility of stolen bird skins or feathers still being circulated around the community by accepting the idea that the museum had no clue how many birds they were missing. Kirk was frustrated with the whole entire conversation because all he was wanting was for someone in this whole entire burglary scheme at the Tring to stop rationalizing it and to take some responsibility. Kirk and Long spent the entire afternoon discussing this, but they also discussed what it meant to be a friend and what that friendship is really worth. Long felt like the right thing to do was to stick by Edwin's side, no matter what anyone thought of him and what he did, because that's what friends are supposed to do. Kirk realized that Long had a deep admiration for Edwin. He was very proud that Edwin wanted to be his friend, but admittedly, he didn't know him all that well. Eventually, the more that Kirk talked to Long, the more he realized how vulnerable he had been to someone that he idolized like Edwin, and that it was starting to look like Edwin not only was using Long to help him get rid of the bird skins, because Long was so eager and excited to be his friend, it was kind of getting to a turning point for Kirk where he began to feel upset towards Edwin, who seemed to have taken advantage of Long's admiration for him and his fly tying. He was flattered that Edwin wanted to be friends with him and used him to help him sell the bird skins. Long became Edwin's middleman. Kirk started to believe that, and in order to distance himself from the selling of the skins online, Edwin funneled everything through Long. Long would be the one who accepted payments, he would forward the money to Edwin, and then Long would send the bird skins off to the buyer. And looking back at all the hours that they had spent together talking about the crime, Edwin didn't seem bothered by the fact that it would follow him around forever, that he'd always be known as that guy who broke into the Tring and stole 299 bird skins, all in the name of feathers, flutes, and fly tying. But at the same time, Kirk could see that Long was carrying this heavy burden with him, and he probably would for quite some time to come. By the next morning, after spending hours upon hours talking to Long, Kirk couldn't help but feel that the whole reason for him having gone to Norway in the first place had all but vanished. He had gone from being 100% convinced that Edwin was the naive, gullible one being used by this cunning criminal mastermind to finding Long to be nothing more than an unguarded young man with an injured soul who lost both of his parents, that put his trust in Edwin and in their friendship and ended up getting burned. And Kirk didn't get any closer to figuring out where the rest of the missing bird skins were at. And it also frustrated him as to how little Long was saying that he remembered, at least that's what he claimed, when it came to the numbers of birds and feathers that he had actually handled on Edwin's behalf. But Kirk had really taken a liking to Long, and he really felt sorry for him. So he wondered if Long had picked up on that and just played into it. Kirk was so ready to turn Long over to Detective Hopkin and let the British law enforcement get some measure of justice in prosecuting him since they failed to do so in prosecuting Edwin. But now Kirk didn't want to do that. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something that Long was holding back. Something that if Kirk could figure out what it was, he would leave Norway satisfied. Kirk and Long met up once again, this time at the National Gallery in Oslo. This was a place where there was another famous museum break-in, where one of Edvard Munch's versions of the Scream was stolen during the opening ceremonies for the 1994 Winter Olympics held in Lillehammer. I didn't realize until I looked into the scream a little bit more that there were 4 versions of it created by Munch, 2 with paint and 2 with pastels. The first one was shown at the National Gallery in 1893, and it is in their collection today. This particular version of the scream has the words, "could only have been painted by a madman," written in Norwegian in the reddish-orange portion of the sky in his painting. Not all the way in the upper corner, but barely visible towards the upper left side of the sky. It was thought to have been written there, perhaps by an art critic, but a handwriting analysis revealed that it was written by Munch himself. One of his pastel versions of the scream is at the Munch Museum, also located in Oslo. The second pastel version from 1895 had been owned by a Jewish banker working in Munich, Germany, and an art collector named Hugo Simon. He sold it to a Norwegian shipping magnate named Thomas Olsen sometime in 1937, but I will come back to that in a moment. This version was later sold at Sotheby's auction on May 2nd, 2012 for $119,922,600 to financier Leon Black, making it one of the most expensive works of art in the world. Once that sale took place, however, the heirs of Hugo Simon came forward and questioned the sale, believing that it had been looted from him by the Nazis, that he was forced to sell it when he had to flee Germany when they came into power. The Simon heirs initially contested the sale, but that didn't seem to go anywhere. But then when the scream was set to be loaned to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, they called on the museum to explain in their display the history behind the painting. I stated earlier that Simon had sold it to a Norwegian shipping magnate. He was the consignor, and it was ultimately displayed in a Swiss art gallery. Hugo Simon and his family had fled from Germany and headed to France. Once the Nazis made their way into France, Simon procured fake passports for himself and his family, and they fled to Brazil. According to a 2014 article in Newsweek, it examined the search for art stolen by the Nazis. It was Hugo Simon's great-grandson, a Brazilian art curator named Rafael Cardoso, who believed that his great-grandfather was forced to let the scream go because of Nazi persecution. But there is a question as to whether Simon was actually forced to sell the artwork or if he sold it as a matter of business dealing. Nobody knows how much Simon was paid for this version of the scream. The heirs of the Norwegian consignor offered Simon's heirs compensation for the painting, but they turned it down, and the auction went forward in 2012. The scream that was stolen from the museum where Kirk and Long had met up at, as I said, happened while all eyes were on the opening ceremonies of the Winter Olympics on February 12, 1994. 2 men had broken into the art gallery and left a note behind saying, "Thanks for the poor security." A ransom of $1 million was demanded, but the gallery refused to pay. The following month, Norwegian law enforcement arranged a sting operation with the help of British law enforcement and the Getty Museum. The sting was successful and the painting was recovered on May 7, 1994. 4 men were convicted in January of 1996, including a guy named Paul Inger, who already had a conviction on his record for stealing another one of Munch's paintings called Vampire 6 years before he stole the scream. However, all 4 men won an appeal, and they were released when it was discovered that the British law enforcement agents who assisted with the sting operation traveled to Norway using false passports. But anyway, after they met up at the gallery, Kirk and Long spent the day walking around town. They had lunch, and they talked. Long carried on with the small talk, but Kirk was really just wanting to know what it was that Long wasn't telling him. And he finally said, "Look, I hear you. I believe you. I get you. But I can't help but feel like there's something that you aren't telling me." In Kirk's book, this is how this part of their conversation went. Kirk said, "Even if you were a trusting person and looked up to Edwin, It seemed like there were so many steps where a reasonable person would say, "What is going on here? You're not a dummy. You're a very bright, talented person." Long provided an answer after a lengthy silence. "I feel like there shouldn't be any reason to believe me because it sounds so illogical. I feel like just being in that situation is so hopeless. I'm not holding anything back, but it feels like being trapped inside this cage. It doesn't matter what I tell you." Kirk said, "No, nothing is hopeless. It does matter what you say. I've heard from 2 people in the last year that you've told them you had tons of Indian crow. And I don't know what to make of that, whether to doubt what they're saying or to doubt you. I'm just trying to..." And then Long interrupted him and said, "Exact the truth." "So what am I supposed to do with that knowledge?" "You do whatever you need." "But is it true?" "Yes." "You have a lot of Indian crow?" "I have. I still have some of the packages of the ones I was supposed to sell." "How many?" 110, maybe." "Birds?" "No, just feathers." "We're in 2015 now. What did you have 4 years ago?" "It's really hard to just number because there's a low number in each package. I didn't count those, like how many packages and how many feathers. I don't remember how many were sold. I think maybe I sold half of them, and then I had half of the packages." Long eventually admitted to Kirk that the total number of feathers that he had was somewhere between 600 and 800. The 2 of them found a place to sit down and eat, about a mile or so from the National Gallery, and Kirk was able to get Long to admit how many of the birdskins Edwin had sent him. It was somewhere between 10 and 20, nowhere around 50 as Kirk had suggested. After he had said that, Long searched Kirk's face for a reaction. But all he said is that he wanted to see them. He had to see them. And Long agreed, and soon Kirk saw tears begin to trickle down Long's face. He excused himself so he could regain his composure in the restroom. Kirk couldn't help but think back to when he had visited with Edwin, and how he insisted that Long was in no way, shape, or form involved. He then wondered what Edwin told Long after the interview that Kirk had with him. Long did admit that Edwin called him and told him to go ahead and talk to Kirk, but to keep it in his mind that Kirk is not his friend, and that Long shouldn't even try to become his friend. They don't owe Kirk anything, no explanations, no truth, no nothing, and to make sure that Kirk pays for everything that they do together, whether you travel or eat or whatever. Long told Kirk that he carefully hid everything in a box before he arrived at his apartment. As they headed back there, Kirk began to wonder what might happen if he were to tell Detective Hopkins what he'd learned about Long. As they slowly walked up the footpath through the forest towards his place, Kirk asked him how he was feeling. "Empty," Long said. He went inside his apartment and came back out with a stamp collecting album. They were going to walk over to a nearby bar or a pub, but Kirk couldn't help but begin flipping through the pages. They were all filled with blue and orange feathers. Kirk described this moment that he saw the feathers as exhilarating. As he went through and took pictures of each of the page of feathers, he thought about the journey that those feathers had made to wind up in this stamp collecting album in Norway. The birds collected 150 or more years ago from their native habitats. The 2 young, talented, ambitious kids from opposite ends of the world brought together through their mutual love of fly tying, and Kirk's own vacation from that burnout that led him to go salmon fishing in New Mexico, where his guide told him of the Tring Heist. Yet this album, while those feathers had transcended more than a century's time and thousands of miles across the world, the feathers in that stamp album were but a tiny fraction of what was still missing from the Tring. No more than maybe one bird's worth. Kirk handed him back the album as they continued looking for a place to have some beers. He broke the silence and asked Long how he felt about letting him see the feathers. Long said worse than he felt when his mom died. He then asked Kirk if he would return them to the Tring. He decided to tell Long that it was up to him if he wanted to return them. Kirk had envisioned himself coming away from this visit with a whole bunch of bird skins, intact with their biodata tags, and returning those to the Tring. But that obviously wasn't going to happen. Long asked him what the museum would do with the feathers. Kirk said probably nothing. Put them in storage where they will sit for countless centuries to come. Several months after Long and Kirk met and talked, Long emailed him and told him that he was continuing to struggle with the fallout of what he had been involved with. His grades in school were suffering, and he was filled with shame that he let something like fly tying take over his life like this. He also told Kirk that he hadn't sent the feathers back to the museum yet. Kirk wasn't surprised knowing that Long was so attached to them. He also decided to not tell Detective Hopkins what he found out when he visited Long. Clearly he was struggling through the whole thing. He certainly didn't need any more problems to deal with. Besides, Long was far more consumed with guilt and regret than Edwin was. Kirk came to the conclusion that the only reason Edwin brought Long into this whole mess was because he wanted the digital footprints, if discovered by investigators, to lead to Long instead of himself. That's the only thing that made sense. There was nothing that Long did that Edwin couldn't have done on his own, and it's the only reason why he would bring Long in that Kirk could see. Long made the posts, he accepted the payments, he forwarded the money to Edwin, Edwin sent the birds to Long, and Long sent them to the customers. He was set up to take the fall. Edwin took advantage of someone who looked up to him and admired him and valued their friendship. This also led Kirk to further question Edwin's Asperger's diagnosis. If he could pull this off, he certainly could fake that too. Kirk tried talking to Dr. Simon Baron Cohen, but he couldn't discuss Edwin without Edwin's permission. He knew that, and we all know that. He asked the doctor if it was possible for someone to fake having Asperger's. All the doctor would say was, in the end, it's a clinical judgment. You can't test for it like you can test for cancer and get a definitive diagnosis. So in theory, when given a questionnaire and interviewed by a doctor, if the patient is lying, it comes down to the expert's opinion. The doctor also asked Kirk to have faith in his experience and his diagnosis. But when he looked at the report that Baron Cohen submitted to the Crown Court, which, by the way, was leaked to Kirk by a friend of Edwin's, there were things that Kirk knew to be false in that report, namely that Edwin wasn't motivated by money and that Edwin didn't feel like he did anything bad by taking a bunch of old dead birds. Kirk had come to realize, after years of chasing the story, that none of that was true. But the doctor had only one encounter with Edwin and formulated his diagnosis based on that. So is that legitimate enough for Kirk to go ahead and dismiss the doctor's findings? I will leave that up to you listening to decide for yourselves. A couple of years after Edwin's sentencing, the American Psychiatric Association dropped Asperger's from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and folded it into the autism spectrum. Kirk was feeling like the story was reaching its conclusion. The fly tying community felt as though the whole thing had sputtered to an anticlimactic conclusion. He was satisfied to know Long's truth and that he got to see the feathers that he still had left. But Kirk was disappointed that he wasn't able to track down any more of the missing birds. He decided to go through all of the interviews that he had with all the people over the years involved in this just one more time to make sure that he covered all the bases. And there was one person that was very close to Edwin and to the Tring that he was unable to track down. This would be Edwin's Canadian fly tying friend, Luc Couturier. He was the one who emailed the Tring some years before the heist and asked if the museum would sell him some Indian crows. They had turned him down, and it was Luke who suggested to Edwin that he visit the Tring once he arrived in England. The museum had found Luke's request to be sold birdskins to be so odd that when the break-in did occur, they actually mentioned him to Detective Hopkin. When Kirk spoke to Edwin, he told him that his friend Luke had visited the Tring sometime back in the 1990s, but the museum insists that no such visit ever happened. Edwin also said that when he sold the birds, he had gifted a couple of them to Long as his friend and as someone who loved fly tying so much and was so good at it. So Kirk wondered if Edwin had also gifted any of those birdskins to Luke as well. He began looking for him online. Kirk found a LinkedIn account, but it was pretty dormant. He did see that one of his contacts on LinkedIn was Dr. Paul Sweet, who was the manager of the Natural History Museum in New York. So Kirk emailed Dr. Sweet asking about Luke. He responded that back in 2010, Luke wanted access to the museum's collection of the same birds that Edwin had taken from the Tring. Indian crows, blue chatterers, you all know by now. When Luke was asked about the reason for the visit, he said, "To refine my knowledge and test some of my hypotheses." The museum denied his request. Kirk continued to look for Luke online. He checked in on the fly tying forums, but it did not appear he had been active for quite some time. He did manage to get Luke's email address from one of the members, and he emailed Luke, but never received an answer. Kirk became friends with people on Facebook with the same last name as Luke, but still came up with nothing. Kirk also reached out to John McLean, the first and only fly tyer to speak to Kirk at the Somerset Fly Tying Symposium, to see if he knew where to find Luke or what happened to him, but he said that he hadn't seen Luke since 2009. What happened back then was Luke had agreed to share the cost of a hotel room with that admin of the classic fly tying forum. His name was Bud Gudry. He was the one who had worked really hard to try and eradicate any talk of Edwin or the museum or the heist from his website. So yeah, he and Luke had split the cost of a hotel at that year's fly tying symposium. But after they had shared that hotel, Bud discovered that Luke had stolen a credit card from his wallet and charged thousands of dollars on it from purchasing things at the symposium. From there, John McLean had cut ties with Luke, but he gave Kirk the name of another person who was also friends with him. His name was Robert DeLise. Kirk sent a message to Robert through Facebook asking if there was any way if he could put him in touch with Luke, but he told Kirk that he would not be able to contact him. He'd long been out of touch, just off the grid. In 2010, Luke had suddenly become unemployed and he fell on hard times. He was forced to sell off his entire collection of birdskins and feathers, and Robert himself had spent about $40,000 buying much of what Luke had. After that, Luke dropped out of the fly tying world. Kirk asked what kind of birdskins he had. Robert listed off several of the exact species of birds that had been taken from the Tring, among others. Robert said he had some of everything that fly tyers obsessed over. Kirk then asked, did the skins still have tags on them? And Robert said yes, they did. Kirk asked if he could see. Robert told him that he would get back to him. Kirk spent the next several hours looking at pictures on Robert's Facebook, looking at all the pictures that he had posted of salmon flies, feathers, bird skins. There were literally hundreds and hundreds of pictures to go through. From everything that Kirk was seeing, if there was a way that he could figure out if the bird skins that this guy posted on Facebook had come from the museum, then he would be able to account for at least 20 of the missing skins. Eventually, Kirk discovered that Robert had a very active eBay account and had amassed more than 2,000 sales worth of birdskins and feathers through the site. So if any of those birds that he had gotten from Luke, and if Luke had gotten them from Edwin, and if Edwin had gotten those from the Tring, they were long gone. Kirk found other sellers on eBay that had bird skins for auction that were the same species taken from the Tring. He'd come across a guy out of the state of Washington named Doug Millsap who was selling quite a large number of very rare bird skins on the auction site. He had so many sales that Kirk hired someone to put everything onto a spreadsheet for him. Many of the bird skins that he advertised were endangered and protected, which goes against eBay's rules. But it seemed like they got around that by using the Latin names for the birds, and they were able to post their sales without getting flagged. But Kirk definitely found species of birds being sold by both Doug and Robert that were prohibited by law to be sold. Kirk tried contacting eBay, but they didn't reply. He finally sent them links to the illegal postings and asked how eBay expected the commissions that they would be making on the sale of illegal wildlife specimens to be interpreted. Then Kirk got a reply from the senior manager of global corporate affairs named Ryan Moore, but it was mostly the standard kind of large corporate policy rundown and that they were committed to prohibiting the sale of illegal wildlife. Not that they were doing it, but they demonstrated a commitment to doing it. Kirk provided Moore with links to sales where Latin names were being used to sell the skins of endangered birds, and when Kirk went back to eBay and looked for the links that he had sent, they were gone. After that, Robert DeLeese stopped replying to Kirk's messages. So Kirk decided to go onto the fly tying forum where all the talk of Edwin and the Tring was banned. He made a post asking the entire community to help track down the still missing bird skins. He figured that if Edwin was the only one who was the black sheep of the community, then there shouldn't be a problem with trying to work together to try and solve this. Members of the forum went into an uproar over Kirk's post, accusing him of coming in there and causing problems, that if Kirk cared so much that he should donate the money that he makes off of his book to the museum. The admin of the page told Kirk that he would leave the post up for now, but if it really starts to go bad, he was taking it down. And it wasn't too long after that the admin contacted Kirk once again and told him he had to take it down, that he had received messages from 41 different members demanding that the post be removed. Kirk could not help but wonder why everyone was so bothered by this. All he wanted to do was help get the items back that had been stolen. They could even be sent back anonymously. But everyone was so pissed off about the post that it had to go. Several weeks after Kirk had first spoken to Robert about his connection to Luc Couturier and subsequently went silent, Robert finally did reply back to Kirk, but he had done a complete 180. He claimed that the birds that he received from Luc had no biodata tags on them, but at first he said that they did. He then said he didn't know anybody named Luc when he said that he had spent $40,000 buying bird skins and feathers from him. And then several minutes after Kirk asked him one final question, he replied, "Good luck," and never spoke to Kirk again. Kirk could not let go of wanting to know what happened to Luc, and if he was even alive for that matter. Where did he go after he lost his job and sold off his collection of birds and feathers? Was he homeless someplace, living on the streets somewhere in Quebec? Kirk wasn't sure if he had it in him to try and make that kind of a search for this guy. His wife finally told him, even if you found out that Luc did get birds from Edwin, they're long gone by now. And she wasn't wrong. It's just that Kirk wanted to know. So when we do a final tally of what Kirk may have discovered in his search for the missing skins, which he figured based on what the museum had received back was about 64 that were unaccounted for. He had found 2 in South Africa. If Long was accurate that he had received 20 bird skins from Edwin that he sold off, that brings the number of missing birds down to 42. If Luc had skins from the museum based on what Robert told him he had purchased from Luc when he lost his job, that would bring the number of missing bird skins down to 22. But Kirk was always one step behind everyone else. Luke's birdskins were gone, as were the ones that Long had. The South African guy could give a rat's ass about the museum and its birds. He was too busy getting ready for his ultimate meeting with God. There was always a chance that Edwin was lying this whole time and had the 64 birds stowed away in his closet. Edwin never spoke to Kirk again after their one and only meeting. The only thing Kirk had seen up close and in person were those feathers that Long had, and he was pretty sure that Long wasn't going to send them back to the Tring Museum. In the process of all of this, Kirk discovered that Edwin wasn't the first fly tyer to break into a museum to steal birdskins. 2 museums in Germany had been broken into by an American posing as an exterminator, who, while spraying the place for bugs while the museums were closed, stuffed his coveralls with dozens of Indian crows and blue chatterers. Kirk found that there were these 2 different types of human beings that flowed through this journey. There were the scientists who brought these birds to the museums, the likes of Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin, the museum curators who cared for and protected their specimens, the members of law enforcement who stepped in when something like what Edwin did happened, those who had spirited the birds away from the Nazis' bombings, researchers who examined the birdskins in search of scientific data and answers to questions so humanity could understand this world a little bit better. And then there were those who were like Edwin and all the others that longed for these rare, elusive birds and feathers. The people who for centuries plundered the earth, the woods, and the skies of these birds, driven by greed, social status, or to just have what others could only dream of having. A few months later, Kirk received a text from Long. He had been doing some soul searching, and he decided that he was going to embark on a crusade to promote what he called sustainable fly tying. He was turning his skills as a master fly tyer into a movement to promote the use of common feathers while protecting rare and endangered birds. Kirk was really pleased with the direction that Long was headed. But when Long finally posted about it in the forums, his friends in the fly tying community sneered and ridiculed the idea. That Long just had no idea what it felt like to tie with a real thing, and that he didn't get it, nor could he appreciate the history of fly tying. And from there, not much changed. You can still buy protected bird feathers and skins on the forum and on eBay. Long was discouraged that his friends had scoffed and laughed at his concept of sustainable fly tying. At one point, Edwin had explained all of this to Kirk by saying, "When something is forbidden, it makes people want it more. Knowing that you're working with fake feathers never ceases to eat away at you. It happens to every fly tyer. They can't accept their flies as being worth anything if they're using fake feathers." In his book, Kirk shared the story of a fly tyer named Eddie Wolfer, who owned a live blue chatterer. There came a time when Eddie had been taken to the hospital for brain surgery, a procedure that required a metal plate to be affixed to his skull. While he was hospitalized, a couple of fly tyers came to his house and somehow convinced his girlfriend to sell them his blue chatterer. They killed the bird and sold the skin at a fly tying event. That's how desperate fly tyers can get. Not all of them, but these things do happen. Kirk asked Long if he had sent the feathers back to the Tring. He said that he would soon. About 5 years after Kirk began his journey into the story, he randomly received an email from the great-grandson of Alfred Wallace. His name was Bill. He shared a story from a few years back when the Tring Museum had invited his 93-year-old father, Alfred Wallace's grandson, to visit the museum and the birds that his grandfather had collected. He accepted the invitation, and when they went into the bird vault, they pulled out the drawer where they kept the birds of paradise that Wallace had collected and found it to be empty. By the way, dreamers, Kirk Johnson's middle name is Wallace. He also gave the middle name to his son, who was born about the time his role in this whole story was coming to an end. And the fly tying world would carry on. If anyone had anything that had been stolen from the Tring Museum by Edwin, all that needed to be done was to remove that biodata tag, and that skin and its parts would freely circulate through the community. Breaking into museums and stealing birds became more of a joke than anything else to these fly tyers. In January of 2016, a package was delivered to Dr. Priest Jones at the Tring Museum. There wasn't a return address, but it was postmarked from Norway. When the package was opened, there was nothing in it but a Ziploc bag full of bird feathers. The bag was taken down the long hallway of the bird vault, all the way to the end, and this bag from Norway was placed into a drawer, overflowing with a stack of evidence bags filled with other bird feathers, parts, and skins. The curator slid the drawer back into its place and closed the cabinet. And that is the conclusion of the series, The Tale of the Feather Heist. I hope you all enjoyed this as much as I did, and I want to thank you so much for listening to each and every one of these parts. Please go to the California Dreaming Facebook page and like the page and leave a review if you want. Join the discussion group also on Facebook. You can follow the show on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and on Instagram at California Dreaming Pod. If you would like to gain access to more content, there are dozens of full-length episodes available on California Dreaming's Patreon. Members at all levels have access to most of the episodes starting at only $1 a month. Thank you again so much for listening. Thank you for your support, for all the positive feedback, for all the love and everything else you all do that gets me motivated to keep doing this. I'm your host, Roseanne, and until next time, sweet dreams.